uniformity fast. You can create that. Okay, but now what are the problems you create when you do that? You lose the checks and balances, you lose the diversity of perspectives, you create the potential for unintended consequences that haven't been sort of worked out gradually in the states as they adopt things. You create all kinds of things.
You can design it in the system.
Well, I've thought about it for years because
Flexibility.
I am, okay,
Sure.
But if you create flexibility in order to, you know, what do you mean by flexibility? Again, is if it's a rules-based approach.
Principle-based approach.
See, now we get back to, again, the motivations and the incentive conflicts and the monitoring problem. And you've got to solve that.
Yes.
And you've got to create incentives on the legal entity, on the group supervisor. You've got to create incentives for them to do the things that benefit the host country supervisors in host country policyholders in times of crisis. How do you create those incentives? Well, there's two ways. You can create a top-down approach where you have uber regulators that monitor that home group supervisor. Well, that's just another layer of regulation. Or you can create the opportunity for the fellow supervisors to push back. And that's what you got to have. And that's what we have in the U.S. That's what creates the problem, is that the fellow supervisors have the ability to push back.
I'd like to move you both on now. You've illustrated similarities and differences across the Atlantic. But of course, across the Atlantic is the most important trade relationship in the world, the US-EU trade relationship. There's the start now for some time of the US-EU regulatory dialogue. What is that trying to achieve? And given the scale of differences that the two of you have revealed, what are its prospects for achieving anything?
Well, that brings me back to what Terri was talking about. I mean, one of the features of the European Union is that we are part of the global world. I mean, Europe has a lot of very important, large insurance undertakings that operate across the world. So for us, in the design of something like Solvency II, not to think about the international ramifications would have been crazy. And that's why, because I like Terri so much, that I took my flight to Washington to talk to her. And we had the EU-US dialogue. We spent many meetings, many times. We often disagreed, often disagreed. But I think that what we have learned doing that is that when we talk to the United States, we may sometimes need to change the words. For instance, when you go to the US and you talk about equivalence, the Americans don't understand that concept. They have great difficulties with that. In Europe, we work with that. I mean, the Germans will accept that something French can be equivalent. And neither the Germans nor the French have any problem with that. But in the US, when you use the word equivalent, you always get the feeling that they perceive that, something could be as good as the US system. So it means that, when we look at the equivalence of the US system to the European system, we somehow look down at the US, which it is not the case. And I think that is the prospect of the EU-US dialogue. And the Omnibus II directive, as you know, has now been adopted, will be published in the official journal. And we have there a regime that deals with third countries. And what do we do with operations of EU undertakings in third countries, for instance, the US, or situations whereby the parent of a group is based in the US and the operations in the EU. So there is a system in the Omnibus II directive which is based on a concept of equivalence. But when we started the dialogue with the US, we didn't use the word. We said we are looking for ways and means to have a cooperative understanding between the EU and the US on insurance issues. And I think that that is probably the way we're going to move forward, is to identify some basic issues and to try to agree and to say, okay, you do it that way, we do it that way. We're not going to qualify you as worse or better. We're just going to accept that. But what we need, Paul, and that is very important, and I have underlined it many times in the dialogues, is we need to be convinced, both sides, that we have a common interest in working together and agreeing on the basic issues.
So Terri, I'll ask you the same question in just a second, but just, I was, as you were speaking, Carol, I was reminded of what someone said, that there is no greater language barrier in the world than that between European English and American English. Terri.
That was Shakespeare, I think.
I think what Carl said is generally correct, that, you know, what we want to do is, we all understand that this is an increasingly global world. We all understand that we have more firms operating internationally and that we have to find ways to work together. And I think the issue on the table is, how much do we need to push toward more consistent or uniform systems around the world in order to get there, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of having greater uniformity across the world. And it's a little bit like the discussion that, you know, we have in the U.S. about U.S. insurance regulation. So as we had these discussions, when Europe says, you know, equivalence, we need to assess you against Solvency II, there's kind of an implicit sense that you gotta have the things that Solvency II expects. And there are some real differences. You know, the U.S., I would say, there's an actuary in the U.S. that explained it one time, and it really caught my attention. And that is Solvency II. You're going to disagree with me on this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Solvency II is really it's 3 pillars: Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Pillar 3. But the emphasis is on Pillars 1 and 2.
No.
Okay, I knew you were going to disagree with me, but I'm going to say
it's not correct.
Relative. Okay, but let me just add this. Let me say this then. Relative to the U.S., Europe places more emphasis on Pillars 1 and 2, and the U.S. places more emphasis on Pillars 2 and 3. So they're very different systems. And our emphasis on Pillar 2 and 3 goes to all of the data, all of the analysis, all of the public disclosure, trying to marshal public discipline. And you got to agree with me that public disclosure in the U.S. is more robust.
Not only in insurance. It is the traditional way in the U.S. to do regulation. I mean, the SEC
It's public.
is based...
Everything's public.
Public,
Okay.
and that's true. But on the Solvency II, the 3
right.
pillars are of equal importance.
Okay, all right. Yes, I know you say that, yes. So we have a lot of, and these tools are things we think, you know, if you read, again, going back to the literature, and in the banking, most of what's been written on financial regulation is in the banking sector. There's a little bits in insurance, but most is in the banking sector. These guys are all over writing about this stuff. And, you know, they've concluded that you need a balance. And there are actually, you know, strong differences of opinion over whether regulatory oversight is better than market oversight, but everybody agrees market oversight is important. And this is, on balance, we tend to go there. So I'm going to give you an example. AIG had a problem with securities lending. You may have heard about this. You know, AIG, the largest part of the problem was AIGFP, the Financial Products Division, the credit default swaps. But they also had a securities lending problem. And that is that they had lent out securities, taken in collateral, and invested that collateral in illiquid instruments, mortgage-backed securities, residential mortgage-backed securities, and so forth. And so when AIG was, you know, got into some financial difficulty, the counterparties wanted their collateral back, and AIG had a liquidity problem. The regulators, I could talk about this for a while, but the bottom line, what I want to talk about, focus on, is what the regulators did in response to that problem. Now, you could go a lot of directions. You know, you could say, well, we're going to start having restrictions on the kind of securities lending you can do, and they did some of that. You could say, we're going to have certain capital charges for securities lending, and they didn't really go that route. What they said is, we are going to be fully transparent to the market. Anybody doing securities lending, we're going to have now a new section on our financial statements. You got to disclose it. Now, regulators all over the country know about it. Analysts all over the world know about it. Wall Street securities analysts, they know about it. And we're going to leverage their help to support the risk management culture in this industry. And rather than, they specifically didn't go the capital route. And that's because capital is a pretty darn blunt instrument. Capital, regulatory capital, is never, never going to be perfectly right. And so you got to be as, careful about unintended consequences as you are about the things that you're trying to do. It's just not going to be perfect.
Yeah,
Carol, do you want to respond, and then I'm going to move the discussion
just very quickly. I think that disclosure is important, but if you look at Enron, for instance, everything was in the prospectus, but nobody had read it. So disclosure alone does not help you. And that is why, under Solvency II, Terry, we have this combination of the three pillars. And they work together. A disclosure is an essential feature, but you can't say that your rules on capital or risk management, which are very much interlinked, are less important. I think they're equally important.
We agree. We agree all elements of the three pillars are important. But I will still say I think the balance is different between the U.S. and the EU. The role that risk-based capital plays in the U.S. is different. I have heard you say that Solvency II Pillar 1 is designed to incent risk management and effective management of capital. We would say in the U.S. trying to come up with a regulatory capital requirement that creates incentives to manage risk is a fool's errand because you can't ever get there. It's never going to be perfect. It's just there's too much going on. So it's not about creating effective risk management. It's about sort of creating a baseline and then saying,